Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for presenting a panel that looks more like America. I have been critical in the past, and I want to compliment you for the optics. We do have gender balance, and I'd like to compliment the Democratic staff because we tend to balance when it comes to ethnicity. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that this is taken in the spirit that is given. It's not enough for things to be right, they must also look right. And this looks a lot better than some of our all-white panels that we've had. Thank you, sir. Now, with that said, Ms. Marcellin, and if I'm not enunciating properly, please let me know.
That's perfect, yes.
All right, thank you. U.S. regulators, are they not a part of the international organization that we have come to know as Basel?
Yes, they are.
And do they have a fair amount of influence when decisions are being made, or are they excluded from the decisions? They deliberate, but they don't have a voice when it comes to making decisions?
Thank you for that question. You know, the Federal Reserve is the largest and most powerful central bank in the world. When the Federal Reserve speaks, people tend to listen. The idea that they are, you know, as someone said before, a standard taker and not a standard maker on this global body is, I would say, a very creative view. Not to mention, unlike other countries who have one or two of their prudential regulators, the United States has the Fed, the OCC, the FDIC, and the New York Fed that sits on the on BCBS. So we have a very large amount of influence on this body.
Perhaps it's the name that confounds and confuses. Perhaps if it were called the U.S. Committee, we could embrace it with a greater degree of alacrity. But be that as it may, let's continue. There's this notion that we don't need any additional capital for our banks. Can you give us a discussion, just briefly if you would, on the downward trends in capital for the GSIBs that you've seen since 2017?
Yes, thank you for that. You know, with the advent of the pandemic, there was a lot of, obviously, to mitigate the crisis, you know, regulators stepped into gear and did emergency measures, which, you know, put a downward pressure, as detailed by the Kansas Fed, on capital ratios, and even lower if you look at just the supplemental leverage ratio. Not to mention, the Fed also excluded Treasury securities from being counted as part of the denominator for the SLR. That rule has expired, and yes, we're seeing a trend of capital rising a bit at the largest banks. However, you know, as academics have pointed out, including, you know, right-wing academics as well, Mercatus Center and others, that we are nowhere close to optimal levels of capital. If we look at the tier 1 risk weighted ratio, that's estimated, the optimal level for that is estimated to be about around 23%. Right now, we are looking at like 14% around for the average for the largest banks.
Thank you. Final question has to do with performance. Have you found that banks that are better capitalized perform have a better performance record than those that are less capitalized, or are they about the same, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. I would defer to people that are, I consider much smarter than myself, including the Bank of International Settlements, like I said, notable, many regulators, many academics as well, that have shown time and time again that banks, you know, even if we look back to the financial crisis, before the financial crisis, banks that were better capitalized were able to deploy their capital and deploy sources of lending to an economy that was being restricted. And we saw that even with 2009 when the Fed went and implemented stress tests. And what was it, 11 out of 19 banks failed? And then they actually went and required them to access TARP funding, which then, you know, started the U.S. banks having a more resilient system than the European banks, which took a longer time to recover from the global financial crisis.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz is not